Now, as we continue our little tour through the various database objects and functionalities that you'll have to deal with in Transact SQL, the next one up is the concept of a constraint. Now, earlier in the course, we talked about data types, and a constraint is really like a supercharged data type. A constraint is a data type that we have a lot more knobs that we can turn to control exactly what's going on. Notice in our little example table here, let's focus on this age column. Now, we've already talked about, when we talked about data integrity, that we wanted to make sure that these numbers were within a range that we wanted and all that. Well, a constraint is how we would go about doing that, a check constraint. There are other types of constraints. We're going to talk about all that here. But while the data type can say, okay, this needs to be a numeric, it needs to be whole numbers, the data type may not constrain it to the range we want, but a check constraint can. So a constraint can require a specific range. We can even say no more than 2 digits here. We can require unique values if we need to. We wouldn't do that in the case of an age because we could have 2 people the same age. But we can do a lot of different things here with this age column. So a constraint is a great place where we really start to pick up the ability to constrain that data and control exactly what's going in to our database. Now, there are 4 different types of constraints that we can apply to a table. The first one is the primary key constraint. Now, we've already talked about the primary key kind of in general in a video entitled Understanding Primary Keys. Then there's the foreign key constraint, the check constraint, and the unique constraint. So let's look at each one of these just a little bit closer. The primary key constraint we've already talked about. It uniquely identifies each row in a table, and that can be on 1 or more columns. The foreign key constraint, and we'll visit this one a little bit later on when we talk about joins, establishes and enforces a link between 2 tables and between the data in those 2 tables. And we use this link or this relationship to control the data that can be stored in the foreign key table. And when we have the same data in a row, both in the primary key table and then in the foreign key table, then that tells us that the data in the foreign key table goes with that row that's in the primary key table. I hope that made sense, but you'll see it again later on. But the foreign key constraint is usually kind of the other end of a table relationship, if you will. And this is usually, not always, but usually tied to the primary key in the related table. But this has to do with table relationships. That's a new concept for you. Don't panic. We'll come back to it later. Now, the check constraint is the one that you'll see quite a bit. The check constraint and the next one, the unique constraint. But the check constraint is the one we can use to limit the values that are accepted by 1 or more columns. And I can put multiple check constraints on a single column. Now, what can I do with a check constraint? I can say that if it's a value going in, it has to be less than 1,000 or more than 1,600. I can say that it has to be between 15 and 27. I can say, for example, if I'm trying to make sure that somebody's putting a zip code in, it has to be at least 5 digits. Each one has to be either from 0 to 9. I can do all kinds of things with these check constraints to constrict the data, to constrain the data to a certain shape, a certain piece of data, a certain range, all that sort of stuff. And these things can be evaluated out to true, false. There's just a lot of power in these. And so check constraint is the one that you'll see most involved. The unique constraint is another one that's great to have. A unique constraint on a column just ensures that no duplicate values can be entered in that column. So a unique constraint makes sure that no duplicate values are entered in specific columns. And this is a column that does not participate in a primary key. Go back to the primary key again. You'll always end up with a primary key in most tables. And that primary key ensures that there are no duplicate rows. But what about over, say, on the right side of the table? We have some other column, and that needs to be unique values, but it's not part of the primary key. We can simply apply a unique constraint to that particular column. And anytime, so we got 300,000 rows in that table, when someone tries to put a duplicate value in any row in that particular column where we have applied a unique constraint, it'll throw an error and will not allow the insert or the update to happen. So we're going to use constraints to constrain what data goes in our tables. This is going to give us the data integrity that we need. And so as long as you can understand this much about constraints right now, you're doing just fine.